of the New Testament church. And he says to Timothy, in explaining this, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. And then he says 4 words that set us up for where we're going to go over the next 2 days. In like manner also, or just as important, just as critical, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. And so right here in this passage of Scripture, Paul sets us up for something that I would like to just set us up for the next couple of days. So over here, let's take a look at this. Let's say over here we have the men. And so men are commanded in Scripture to act holy. So that's the men. And in this passage, Paul says, I would that men pray everywhere. Number 1, lifting up holy hands. And if I could give you a word, and I have done just due diligence with the English to make them all begin with the same letter. Isn't that really impressive? First of all, we have the appetites of the flesh. Lift up holy hands. We'll talk about that in a minute. For men to keep the appetites of the flesh, the lusts of the flesh, under control. That is their challenge in a holiness area. Lift up holy hands without what? Without wrath. Anger and how they deal with it is a holiness issue for men. And it is not right for men to criticize the ladies because they are not obeying their holiness convictions if they are not living according to men's holiness principles. So when Paul says wrath, he's talking about anger. And I could have used the word wrath, but it didn't begin with the letter A, so I used anger. And then finally he says, without doubting. And I would use this word, and this word is intentional because I think it summarizes apathy. What is apathy? Apathy is a cynical attitude that says, I don't care, I'm disconnected. And men more than women, and I notice this across cultures, I notice this in many, many places where women are more open to the moving of God's Spirit. They respond more emotionally and more freely. And men, many times, because of their cultural upbringing, in many cultures, across many cultures, they are more reserved. And they stand back and they are more logical and they are more cynical and they are more skeptical. And they have apathy, and that is not how God's kingdom operates. And so before Paul goes into the holiness convictions for women, which we will spend a considerable amount of time on in the next 2 days. And the reason we will spend time on the women's areas is because those are the ones that are being attacked, because these are invisible. And you can have these running rampant through your spirit, and nobody knows. So it's easy to fake people out with these. But it's not easy to fake people out with the women's holiness areas because they are areas of appearance. And so they are more attacked in our culture. So consequently, we'll spend some good, solid time explaining to you how to explain to others why we do and why we believe what we believe. But before we get to the women's issues, we will talk about the men's issues. Because Paul said, men, in like manner also, if we're going to expect appearance convictions out of the women, then we expect action convictions out of you. Men are commanded in general in Scripture to act in a way so that women are not tempted. Women are commanded in Scripture in general to appear in a way so that men are not tempted. It dates back to creation. And so then he says, in like manner also, that women adorn themselves. Everyone say adorn. So if we go over here to the women's side of holiness issues, we are talking about appearance. Now, can I stop right before we get into this and say that it is possible, ladies, for a woman to act unholy. And it is also possible for a man to appear unholy. It is not that they can't cross over. It is just that these are the tendencies. Men in general will have more problem with acting holy than appearing holy. And women in general will have more problem with appearing holy and pleasing to God than acting holy and pleasing to God. It's just the way we are wired from creation. So Paul says, I would that in like manner also that women adorn themselves. So we'll use that first word, adornment. When he says adorn, he's referring to this area of adornment. And adornment is how we decorate ourselves. And he said that's more of an issue for women than for men. And we'll talk about that in our session tomorrow and the next day. I would that they adorn themselves in modest, what? Apparel. And when he says apparel, he's referring to our clothing. So these are the words from the Scripture, and these are the words beginning with A that we're going to use. And in some places they correspond, and in some places they don't. But because I really want you to be impressed with how intellectual I am, I made them all begin with the letter A. Whatever. Finally, he says, I would that women adorn themselves, so adorning with modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. You could use many words on this last one. Shamefacedness, sobriety. But what he's talking about is attitude. And he's not just talking about attitudes in general. He's talking about an attitude of shamefacedness or sobriety, or what I would say is submission. A woman is enjoined in Scripture. She is told that she needs to have an attitude of submission. And ladies, what we're really talking about here is the way we decorate ourselves, the way we dress, and your attitude of submission is best expressed, we'll read it in 1 Corinthians 11, in what you do with your hair. And so in that little passage there, Paul outlines to Timothy really a good synopsis of the holiness standards and the major holiness issues for men and for women. It is not that a woman could never be tempted to act unholy. It is not that a man could never be tempted to appear unholy. But in general, these are the areas where we wrestle and we have to work with. This is holiness teaching. These are holiness principles. And so I want to delve into, for the rest of our time today, I want to delve into, for the next little bit, to these holiness issues for men, because they are very, very important. The Bible tells us in Matthew 5, I want to go back to that scripture, verse 27 and 28. You have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already, where? In his heart. Because men struggle with these appetites of the flesh. Let me stop for just a moment and say this. In the Old Testament, people say, well, I'm under grace. I don't have to do very much of anything. I just sit and sip my coffee and serve God, and I don't have to do anything because God did it all, and I'm under grace. You're crazy. In the Old Testament, the law said, don't kill. Guess what the New Testament does? It comes along. Now, this is after we've had 4,000 years of Old Testament history. The law said, don't kill. And we couldn't even live up to that. For 4,000 years. If you summed up the whole Old Testament in one word, the word would be failure. God gives festivals and feasts and sacrifices, and lambs and turtle doves and bullocks and all this stuff, feasts and festivals and temples and tabernacles, and we just keep messing up. Serve God for a while, then backslide. Serve God for a while, then get cold. Serve God for a while, then go into captivity. It's just a mess. If you took one word over the whole Old Testament, it's failure. Now in the Old Testament, the law said don't kill. Jesus comes along in the New Testament knowing that we've already failed the 10 Commandments and makes it harder. In the New Testament, it's not don't kill. It's if you hate your brother in your heart, you're a murderer. Which is a harder law to live, the Old Testament law